It's your typical Sunday morning, and you're going for a picnic with your family. And when you arrive on the scene, you see that big guy on your table. So today, object recognition system are able to tell you that this peculiar scene, never shown to any system before, has a black bear, a deck chair, and a bench. And here are a few of the names of people working hard in computer vision to make systems that are going to reach very, very soon human level performances. On the MIT side, with my colleague Antonio Torralba, we put those objects in context. And a new model that we are publishing next week at NIPS, and I'm going to tell you more about it, will tell you, well, your bear and the chair are in the picnic area. And this is what the system will output. So computer science today and computer vision model, what they can do for brain science is give us many options of the type of computation that generate recognition, detection, even memory. And recognizing the object and the context are the building blocks of vision. I believe that once you have systems that have achieved those performances, we are going to really start a new era of brain science and cognitive science, being able now to reach and mechanism at the level of cognition, and I'm going to show you some examples here. So now turning to the brain, where is recognition realized in the brain? Well, fortunately in the past decade, cognitive neuroscientists, and here you have a selection of them, have made tremendous progress characterizing the function of various regions of the brain dedicated to higher level recognition, like the shape, the size, the function of object. I will show you example on the ventral pathway, as well as context information or information about the spatial layout of the scene or where you are, how the scene extends in space. And functional magnetic resonance imaging with human give the spatial component of the block of scene understanding at the level of millimeters. A lot more can be done, but we already have a good idea of which function, where they are, and how they communicate. So it's about time to add time to basically processing, understanding how vision is realized in the brain. So I'm going to show you a demo. Those demos are describing visual recognition in the human brain at the level of millimeter and millisecond. I'm going to explain in the next few slides how we did this. Just look at this little clock and concentrate on the visual area around 60 milliseconds and see how it goes. Hello, start? It does not start. Okay. All right, of course, it was working on my, give me a minute. Let's see. And of course, this is online. All right, I hope the demo will then therefore work later. You're going to have to wait for a few slides, but this is a work that we did with Radosław Cici, Dimitrios Pantazis, and myself using method from Nikolaus Kriskogote about how to combine MEG and fMRI and have for the first time a look at visual processing in the brain. Hopefully it will work later. So, what's the state right now in computer vision of what we can do regarding object and scene recognition? So let's mind the visual data that are available in the world. And what can happen when computer systems have access to millions and millions of exemplars of images, like the visual human brain? Well, we know that the brain processes information through multiple stages of transformation and representation, moving up gradually to more complex representation. And this is particularly clear in the primate visual system, sequence of processing stage. So now, model, deep architecture that were pioneered by Geoffrey Hinton and Jan LeCun, among others, are suggesting that deep layers, various levels of processing that you can apply to an image, are able to reach performances at object detection and object recognition very close to human performances. So those deep architecture consist of multiple layers of small artificial neuron collection which look at small portion of the input image. And the deep learning method aims at learning the feature hierarchy from low to high level, formed by they start by a combination of lower features, and the feature become more and more complex as you go through the levels, and I'm going to show you some examples. So this algorithm can be seen as learning one transformation to another transformation, how representation transform from one state to the other. And at each step, trying to disentangle better the factor of variations. And to date, this architecture can perform very well near human level with object recognition task using one of the benchmarks in object recognition called ImageNet that has millions of images to learn from and about 1,000 categories. So what we did recently with our group was to add a second type of network and learning procedure. We use what we call a scene-centric network. And we are going to launch next week a new data set, a new benchmark made by about 2.5 million of images of scene that now are going to be able to allow a system to learn which type of environment the system is, just because you're taking a photo from your phone or you're uploading a photo on your machine. And the output of this new scene-centric networks correspond now to the classification of scene. So we are at a stage where there are models out there that will start being very good at identifying from still picture or video if an image has an orange or grapefruit, or if we are in a conference room, a street, or a restaurant. So this places model is actually composed by really a lot of exemplars per category. So in the version we are releasing now, and you can go on the web, you can download the network, you can download the images, and you can play with a demo that should work on your smartphone. We have about 200 vocabulary of 200 scene categories. And the graph shows the distribution of images per category in regards to our data set. And some category like abbey or church or even bedroom reach like 10,000, 50, 100,000 different exemplars. So this is really a very huge data set with a very large variety of images, which allow the network to learn pretty well what are the objects, corners, texture, surfaces, and so on associated with visual environment. And here are examples of the output of the deep architecture that we are using. And you can go to the website and take picture that I was playing with it yesterday night. And it gives as an output the possibility of 3 to 4 type of environment the picture can represent. And so over here for the first one, it said indoor and coffee shop, restaurant, cafeteria. For the second image, it said indoor and supermarket. For the third one, it's a conference center, auditorium. And for the fourth one, it's telling you it's a bus interior, the interior of a bus. It's actually inside a plane. So there's many issues, of course, to be worked out. But in that case, the network doesn't have the vocabulary of airplane inside an airplane. So it gives you the closest responses. So we are building now more categories to represent a quasi-exhaustive list of categories existing in the world with also those images that correspond. And if you go play with this demo, on average it's working out for picture taking in the wild for about 80% of the images in the three first top prediction. So what's very interesting for all of us, computer scientists and neuroscientists, is when we look at those networks that start achieving really very good performances of classification, is actually to look within the layers, within each of those levels, the type of features, if you're working with vision, that are calculated and represent the variance, represent the type of artificial receptive field that those networks have learned. And here, as I propose, we are showing in this work, the type of representation and visualization you can have when a network learns from millions of object-centric images, which is a collection of images really centered on the object, like if you had the image very close to your visual field, versus a scene-centric network that learn from many large images of places where the objects are put into the context of everything else. And as expected, the early layers basically show just a representation of simple, like Gabor's output or simple filters. But as you move up to C2, C3, and level 7 and so on, well, you can see that there is gradual complexity of the type of features that are captured. And for instance, looking at the object 1 on this 5th level, you can see basically there are some centered elements of different shape, of different color, with a slightly different background that represent the type of unit that are used to encode the object. Actually, those are an average image of the 100 top responses of a single artificial unit. You can also go and look precisely at the winner's image that is represented for each of those units. But the average gives you an idea of the representation. And when the network learns a collection of natural images representing scene that represent more what the visual brain sees when we walk or when we go somewhere and so on, so not an object-centered, well, we start seeing some type of features that represent more place-like unit, like the ground or a different type of surfaces that are put together and so on. So those are also available on the website, and you can go and poke and look within those layers to have a notion of the representation that is used, that has been learned by those layers. And here is more focused view on one set of units from, let's say, layer 5 between the object and the scene-centric one. And what's very beautiful here is to see that in the object-centric type of unit, there's kind of a representation that is invariant to the position of the object in the image. So here, if there will be a brown blob at the top corner, then that cell will respond over there. And if the blob is moving and going somewhere else, then cells close by will respond. So here, those architecture were pioneered and defined by Hinton, LeCun, and many others. But they are there. You can download them. You can use the data set that are available. You can combine your own data set. You can make up your own kind of a brain and look at them and see the representation that emerge. For the scene unit, a very different type of representation are shown here that seems to focus more on the layout of the place. So it's very exciting for all of us to have access to that, because those are not toy systems. They start really giving a result that makes sense. So how can we compare those models with the human brain, with the space and time information that the human brain has when we recognize object or scene? So here's what we do, and what many neuroscientists do. So we show people in the scanner object for instance, for half a second each. So you're in the scanner for 1 or 2 hours, and you're looking at those objects. In the era of, for non-invasive ways to capture information in the human brain, there are 2 neuroimaging techniques. The magnetoencephalography, MEG, that will give you millisecond resolution, so the timing of some operation, and fMRI, that will give you millimeter resolution, so the spatial location where you have some responses. So one issue is how to relate the signal from the time and the space, because those are 2 independent signal machine, and there is no one-to-one mapping between one MEG sensor and a voxel, for instance. So one solution that we use in the work I'm going to describe is to represent the relative distances between the signal that represent the object you show. So for instance, let's take a sensor space of 2 sensors, not 300, just 2. We have the signal for the face, the apple, and the hand. And in that 2 sensor space, well, we can see, for instance, and represent the distances, the similarities, how far away those representations are. But you can do the same thing if you have a type of signal, like in that case, the voxel. So let's take 2 voxels, voxel 1 and 2. You have the signal generated for each of those 3 objects, and you can display the relationship. And this is very interesting now, because those 2 independent signals can be related within this new space. So this is not a new idea. This is a type of work and method and idea that was put forward by Nicholas Quisquegorte from a series of papers in 2007 and 2008 on the notion of representational geometry and dissimilarity matrices. And here is an example. You have those 3 objects, and in your signal, the apple and the face have signals that are nearby, that are further away, let's say the hand. So in that case, you can build a dissimilarity matrix that shows that the relationship between the apple and the face is different. They are close by in this space. But now if you have another space of sensor in time, it could be voxel, or could be the responses of model, where in that other space, well, the similarity is different. Now the information is grouped by body part, for instance. Then you will be able to compose a different dissimilarity matrices. And this is at the heart of the method we use to combine space and time. So, specifically, let's take about 15 different people. We put them in the MEG scanner. We show them the object exactly as you saw. And we record every millisecond. There's 306 sensor responses for the apple and the telephone and the face and so on. You need to repeat each object many times, and you put all the signal together to have more strength. But then you have, with all those signals, you can look at how easy it is within your 306 sensor to discriminate the face from the hand. Various methods can be used. We use support vector machine in our publications, but any other distance that can basically discriminate how far a signal is from another should be explored. And if you do that, let's say here we had 92 objects. By 92 objects, you build this dissimilarity matrices. And here, for instance, you can have the result of accuracy using only the MEG signal, differentiating between those 2 objects, the 92 by 92 object. And you do that for every millisecond, so 1,000 seconds, for instance. And you get, for instance, here, this matrix is, let's say, at 170. So now you put the subject in the fMRI scanner. Same subject or different people. We did both. And you can run what we call a searchlight analysis, which move a spherical or cortex patch searchlight through the brain and select at each location a collection of voxel, contiguous set of voxel, and you can vary the size of this patch. And for each patch, you can also perform and build a matrices. So for each center voxel, you also have a matrices representing the distances between your object. And here, if you have 100,000 voxel, then you have 100,000 matrices. And here, 1,000 if you have 1 second, for instance. And we look at the Spearman correlation for every time point with every space location. And here is the result. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Oh, right here. Yes. All right. So I just stop it. Now the clock is going to run up. We are 20 milliseconds. So what you're going to see is when the correlation between an MEG matrices at a certain time point, shown above, and a collection of voxel in the human brain are correlated above a certain threshold. So it means that the representation at the time, 1 to 20 milliseconds, 60, is correlated to the representation existing at that location. There's no surprise, everything starts in the back, visual, and then are going to spread in the ventral stream with some signal going also in the parietal. So let's keep going. We are at 40. Well, 60, growing, finally working. Some parietal at 160, and so on. There are a lot of methodological consideration to take into account with this method, a lot of things to fix. However, it starts giving you a window of the temporal dynamics of object recognition in the human brain. So let's have another look. Starting at 60, growing to the temporal, and then some parietal signal. Very important. If you don't see an activity, a representation here shown in red, it doesn't mean that the brain doesn't have a meaningful representation. We just did not capture it. If it's there, is that something is happening, likely at that time point. So this was what we observed for a collection of objects like the one shown here. So now, what about if you play the same game, but showing a collection of objects that lie on a surface? Object in scene or in different type of context. Object of different sizes, object you can pick up in your hand, or object you can look from far away. So put object in context. We play the same game, about 15 people in both scanners. We combine the signal, and here's what we see. All right, so no mystery. It's going to start with the visual areas. But be attentive, and I'm going to show it a couple of times, what's happening in those regions around 70, 100 milliseconds. I'm going to tell you more about this. So we are at 60. All right. So the pattern is actually slightly different. In this case, when we put object on a background in context, on a layout, literally, on a surface, where you can start having a percept of the 3D scene, something you did not have on the isolated object on the gray background. Well, we have a region called the retrosplenial cortex that's going to show up over here at 75 milliseconds, almost at the same time than the visual. Sorry. And before, at that time, for the other movie, you had more responses in the inferotemporal, in the shape region. And going a little further, those two blobs that are appearing over here are closer to the parahippocampal cortex, some fusiform area, that have been identified as part of the scene context, layout and collection of region that are activated when you look at a representation of the world, not necessarily in 3D, but when you have a layout, a context, which is what we see all the time. So simple variation like those, just looking at objects, putting them in the context or not, using this method of combination can start giving ideas about the type of region that are involved in those calculations, but also at what time. And it's very interesting and surprising to see that some of the region related to space perception for objects are actually activated so early in the visual processing stream. So here what we did was combining time and space. And the work of Nikolaus Kriskogorte is very similar. And what he did was combining information from cell recording in monkey and human fMRI. So, yes?
Just to clarify, the input itself is still a static picture.
Yes.
It's just that you put the context and more information.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it's just a different image. It's just a clip of a different image, yes. But we can look at those representational matrices with any type of input. So now, instead of combining time and space, we can look at the correlation of the representation generated by those similarity matrices, or any other type of representation that will give you similarities and distances between your input. Or for instance here, the fMRI result of the human brain with a model, any type of model. I'm using the deep architecture because they work very well, and they also have the advantage of having different layers. Early layers supposed to process more simple information. Medium layers actually starting showing up some surface characteristic, part of object. Higher level layers that we saw on the visualization start having representation of portion of the whole scene or a collection of objects and so on. And you can also have the images, the same one used to show to human people. Well, you can play them through, run them through the model and extract for each image the responses at level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to, for instance, 8 level. Those number of levels can also change. And look at the representation and the distances between your object, but now in the model space. So if you have, let's say, 8 layers, then you're going to have 8 matrices like this per subject, and you can combine them in different ways. And over here, you still have, if you have 100,000 voxels, you have 100,000 matrices. But we can, again, put them together and look at the correlation. And what this will tell you is when where the representation of the first layer is the most similar in the human brain, as well as the representation of the second layer, the third, fourth, and so on. And if those kind of models somehow represent the information that the human brain may be also representing, then you will expect that from the early to the late layers, you have a signal starting in the visual area and spreading both on the ventral and temporal stream in that case. So this movie is going to run the correlation between the layer earlier to late with the brain. This is a surface representation. The two hemispheres are shown. Here, this is the visual area, V1, V2, and so on. And what you're going to see is as the layer increase in complexity in their representation, the correlation is the highest with region in the ventral and dorsal, so that representation, those colorful blobs, are going to move over here and over there, if the representation match. Hello, sorry. I'm going to have to. Okay. Layer 4, layer 5, you clearly see that the correlation is higher with later layers in basically more higher level, with higher level region. So this suggests that model with different level of processing information, different level of complexity, those models that originally were made, were inspired by the visual stream, actually have something in correlation with the human brain. So it's a start. I'm going to tell more about how we could go from there. So every time the movie moved to show you a different.
Is the blue a negative correlation?
No, over here it's just from higher correlation to lower. Yeah. It's a very good question. Yes. So let's say that we are going to have soon some system, at least in visual recognition, that are at the level of human recognition, or even explaining some of the mechanism. I find this fascinating because when you know where you are and when you recognize what you're looking at, then you can. That's how the human mind works. First, you recognize, envision the type of object and scene, and then you can make inference on those elements. For instance, do you know the person? You can even infer what the person may think or what the person may do next. And one of those high-level cognition phenomenon that is at the core of cognition is really memory. And what makes the fact that you see a scene or you meet someone and you're going to remember or not that person. So I believe that higher-level cognitive questions like memory, prediction, and theory of mind are not within the reach of computer scientists by starting probing, putting together those kind of model and approach. And one example I'm going to give you in a couple of minutes is, can we predict the type of images that are going to be memorable to a lot of people, almost all of us, of the ones that are going to be forgettable. So this is a work done with Aditya Khoshla at MIT. And what we did is we started with a classical memory experiment on the web, show more than 60,000 photographs, really a very large set of photo, for 600 milliseconds each, only a glance. And people on the web play that game. Whenever an image is repeated, then they press a key. So it's a classical old and new memory task. And we have a lot of people doing that game, and we can gather for each image the average memorability it has among all those people playing the game. So now we have all those behavioral data. And well, state of the art in deep learning can also allow you now to model the type of images that are going to be, determine, predict the images that are going to be memorable or forgettable, learning from human behavioral data. So in that case, when we are faced with new input, we can literally remember we are at a party, so we can remember a specific object. This is our glass, we just put it there. Or we come to a new environment and we remember that this is the hotel lobby, and we see it for a second time and so on. So when it goes to memory, then you have to combine the strength of the values data set out there that have both object and scene, and this is what we did with now millions of images that have been labeled in object and scene category, context, and so on, and the model is trained to recognize first this is an orange, this is a banana, this is an elephant, this is a street, and so on, by having a series of output here that can be either an object or a scene. And we know that those models can do pretty well at representing the output of human performances. They are not far human recognition of those objects and scene, and we are talking here about 1,200 different categories. So in a two-step, we can train the model to have the features needed to recognize image, and then do an operation that is called fine-tuning, using all the score of the images there, the 60,001 that are memorable or forgettable, to change slightly the network to have it relearn on the top of the features of recognition, relearn the features associated with what make an image memorable or forgettable. And this work is going to be written very soon and available in 2015 to everyone. And within this collection of images, I'm just showing a snapshot. We have 60,000 of some of the most memorable and the less memorable. There's not surprises here. If something is distinctive, different, interesting, it will be easier to remember that it is something more common. So some of the top remembered image have some funny or peculiar characteristic. But among the 60,000, it is really a collection of a lot of various type of images. And in order to validate how a human can basically have a representation close to another human in terms of memory, when we can look at the correlation between different group of human. So you have a group of human, we have all the score of memory of that group, and we can look at how their score correlate with a different group of human subject images also ranked according to the first group. If the two groups are exactly the same, the correlation should be 1. But of course, there's a lot of variability. You also have your own intention and your own memory coming in. So the correlation between a group and another group is 0.68, which is pretty high. In a series of studies, we found out that this can explain about 50% of the variance of memory, so let's say about half. But now when we compare the correlation between a group of humans and this memorability model based on deep features, and we reach a correlation of 64. Many more analyses are performed right now, which is literally at the level of the human performances, which means that those type of multi-layer model that first learn object and scene and the visual block and are top, then on the top, we find with what make some image more important than others are now able to simulate the performances of a group of people regarding memory. So how can computer science and brain science benefit from one another? So I really see the two fields converging towards a framework that will help for hypothesis testing in both worlds. Because if some model start correlating with some of the representation in the human brain, well, you can be very non-invasive with a model. You can run it with many different of parameters. You can change it. You can see how it impacts the various representation via the correlation or the method of your sensor, the different type of sensor. And on the computer side, well, you can be guided in developing models that are close or not to the human brain or the human mind, but at least give you ideas of what could be represented within those layers. And I think that this convergence is going to give more and more to both a field this power of prediction, prediction of what the system can do next, what could happen next in the future if you can recognize the scene and the object and some of the people in it. You can start making prediction, which is what the brain does all the time. The brain is literally a time machine. Comparing large-scale processing between natural artificial systems, I believe will allow us to understand why biological systems have implemented a certain mechanism, but will allow also to study the strategy that work best for performing specific tasks. Now you can change many things in your experiment as well as in the model. You can characterize the operation when the system is broken, because if you have a visual system recognition that perform near human level for object recognition, well, you can break it. Start simulating possibly autistic recognition and perception, or memory deficit if you have a memory model. And also the interesting question of exploring alternative system that biology has not, the route that biology has not necessarily follow. And in this Wired article by Kevin Kelly is talking about AI like an alien intelligence. And I like this concept because it's saying you can have two different systems that output the same result, but might have very different way to calculate it. And even by having a system that output a result that make us confident that the system has recognized whatever we give it to it, the fact that it is reaching this with a very different mechanism might actually teach us something about other way to implement intelligence. So it could be both, let's implement something like human intelligence, or let's just implement something smart, something that works, and see how we can learn from this. Okay, so I think I'm done with my talk, and thank you for your attention.